A Roman noblewoman had an affair with a gladiator and was sentenced to die in the very arena that had once thrilled her. Liu was condemned to hang before the Chinese court, while Enheduanna was offered to the Babylonian gods as a sacrifice. Cheating was more than just a betrayal in ancient cultures. It was a death sentence. But what made these punishments so extreme? Let's unravel the shocking fates of women who crossed the line in the ancient world. Burning at the stake. In the dark days of medieval Europe, being burned at the stake was the ultimate punishment for women accused of adultery. It wasn't just about cheating, it was about making an example out of them, showing everyone what happens when women step out of line. In 1324, Petronilla de Meath, a maidservant to the wealthy Lady Alice Keitler, became the tragic victim of this harsh justice. Accused of not only adultery but also witchcraft, Petronilla was dragged into a bitter feud between Lady Alice and the church. The church, eager to bring down Alice for alleged sorcery, turned its wrath on Petronilla. Under torture, she confessed to all sorts of dark deeds, including using magic to manipulate men. On November 3, 1324, in Kilkenny, Petronilla was burned alive at the stake. Her death was meant to send a clear message to anyone daring to defy society's strict rules on women's behavior. Meanwhile, Lady Alice, despite her own involvement, walked free, leaving Petronilla to suffer a fate far worse than any betrayal. But how much worse could it get? In some cultures, the punishment for adultery was carried out in a much more public and direct way. Let's see what happened to Shlomit. Death by stoning. To betray a husband in ancient Israel was to betray the very foundation of society. Shlomit, accused of such a crime in 53 BCE, became the victim of a law that left no room for mercy. According to Hebrew law, an adulterous woman was considered a sinner, and her punishment was carried out with brutal public spectacle. In 53 BCE, in the heart of Jerusalem, a woman named Shlomit found herself the target of this merciless form of justice. She had been caught having an affair with a Roman soldier, a scandalous act that enraged both her fellow Israelites and the Roman authorities. Shlomit was dragged into the streets, where a crowd gathered to witness her brutal fate. With rocks and stones hurled at her, she was left to die in the most gruesome way imaginable, a victim of a world that showed no mercy to women who broke the sacred codes of fidelity. But stoning wasn't just about killing a woman, it was about public judgment. In other old societies, women faced even worse consequences, such as being sacrificed to the gods. Sacrificed to gods. In ancient Mesopotamia, women caught in adultery didn't just face human punishment, they were sometimes sent to the gods themselves. According to the laws of the time, adultery was considered a serious offense, one that needed to be cleansed in the most extreme way. In 1750 BCE, under the rule of King Hammurabi in Babylon, the punishment for a woman's infidelity could mean being thrown into the river as a sacrifice to the gods. This wasn't just about death, it was a ritual purification meant to appease the divine and restore order to society. Enheduanna, the wife of a prominent Babylonian merchant, was caught in an affair with a local priest. When the affair became known, the authorities wasted no time in carrying out the punishment. Enheduanna was taken to the river, her hands bound, and cast into the rushing waters. She disappeared beneath the surface, her body swallowed by the river, a tragic end to her betrayal. Moving from divine punishment, ancient China took a much more mortal approach, with women who cheated facing public execution by hanging. Death by hanging. In ancient China, infidelity was considered a grave offense, especially for women. The punishment for a woman caught in adultery could be swift and often brutal. In 620 CE, Liu, a woman from a wealthy family in the Tang dynasty, found herself at the mercy of this harsh justice. Liu had been having an affair with a high-ranking official, a relationship that had been kept secret for months. However, rumors eventually spread and the affair was exposed. The emperor, a stickler for maintaining order in his court, had little tolerance for such breaches of trust, especially when it involved someone of Liu's stature. The sentence was clear. Liu was condemned to death by hanging. On the morning of May 12, 620 CE, Liu was paraded through the streets, her hands bound behind her back. She was then lifted onto a scaffold, and the rope tightened around her neck. With a final jerking motion, she was left hanging in the wind, her life taken in front of the watching crowd. But was hanging the most severe form of punishment? In ancient Greece, women could face a far more terrifying fate. Death by drowning. Adultery in ancient Greece was seen not just as a betrayal, but as a threat to the stability of society itself. It was a crime that could shake the very foundation of family and honor, and the punishment was often as brutal as the crime. In 451 BCE, Thalia, a woman from a respected Athenian family, found herself accused of an affair with a foreign merchant, a relationship that threatened not only her own status, but the reputation of her entire household. When the affair was discovered, it didn't take long for the authorities to pass judgment. Thalia was taken to the Athenian Athenian harbor, where a crowd had gathered to witness her punishment. She was stripped of her clothes, her hands bound, and then thrown into the water. Her body sank into the depths, swallowed by the unforgiving sea, and her life was over, just like that. Drowning was one way to pay for betrayal, but in Imperial China, a woman's fate could be sealed with something far worse: beheading. In Imperial China, a woman's infidelity could cost her far more than just her marriage. It could cost her life. Lady Yang, a well-known figure in the Tang dynasty, was caught up in a scandal that shook the entire Chinese court. She had an affair with General An Lushan, a man with enough power to stir up trouble across the empire. When the affair came to light in 780 CE, the emperor wasted no time in getting her arrested. Lady Yang's trial was a public spectacle where the high stakes of her crime were laid bare for all to see. The senators, keen to set an example, wasted no time in passing a sentence that would send a clear message to anyone considering such an act. The punishment was severe. Lady Yang was sentenced to death by beheading. On the morning of her execution, she was led to the public square, her face pale with fear, but resolute in her silence. In front of a crowd of onlookers, the blade fell. With one swift stroke, her life was taken. Lady Yang's affair had sealed her fate, and the court would never forget the scandal that led to her fall. While beheading was the fate for Lady Yang, others met their end in a far more public and violent spectacle: the gladiator arena, where women's sins were punished before an audience. Death in the gladiatorial arena. Ancient Rome had its own way of dealing with betrayal, especially when it came to women who broke the sacred laws of fidelity. In 49 CE, Julia, a noblewoman, found herself trapped in a web of scandal and shame. Julia had been having an affair with a gladiator, someone far beneath her station, and when her secret was uncovered, it didn't just affect her, it brought dishonor to her entire family. The punishment was as brutal as the crime. She was sentenced to die in the gladiatorial arena. The day of her execution arrived, and Julia was forced into the pit, surrounded by roaring spectators. As the gladiators circled her, weapons in hand, she knew there was no escape. In the blink of an eye, her life was taken by the very men she once watched fight for sport, and her name would be remembered not for her noble birth, but for her tragic end. However, Roman justice wasn't always so grand. For many women, the punishment for adultery was much more personal, often carried out by none other than their own husbands or fathers. Killing by husband or father. In ancient Rome, a woman's dishonor could be considered a family affair, with the husband or father holding the power to decide her fate. In 60 CE, Gaius, a Roman noble, came home to a devastating scene. He caught his wife Livia having an affair with a lover of lower status, and the betrayal was too much for him to bear. Furious and humiliated, Gaius confronted them both in his own home. The law gave him the right to take matters into his own hands, and without hesitation, he killed both Livia and her lover. The crime wasn't just about personal vengeance, it was about restoring his honor. The streets buzzed with whispers about the brutal act, and Gaius's name became tied to the violent way he had reclaimed his dignity. In the eyes of society, it was a harsh punishment, but for Gaius, it was the only way to regain his place among the elite. Yet not all punishments were done in anger. In ancient Athens, exile was a preferred method of punishment, making the crime more about separating the person from society than family revenge. Exile. Not all punishments in ancient Athens ended in death. Sometimes the harshest sentence was simply being cast out, as Themis discovered in 460 BCE. Themis had been married to a respected Athenian man, but her affair with a foreign merchant wasn't just a betrayal of her husband, it was an offense against the very fabric of Athenian society. When the truth came to light, the city's officials wasted no time in deciding her fate. Rather than executing her, they sentenced her to exile. Themis was forced to leave the city she had known her whole life, her reputation tarnished beyond repair. She was sent to live on the outskirts of the empire, in a remote and desolate land where survival was a constant struggle. The harsh climate, isolation, and absence of familiar faces turned her days into a life of hardship. She could never return. The streets she had once walked now seemed distant and cold, a reminder of everything she had lost. Her life in Athens was over, and she was left to wander alone in the wilderness of shame. While Themis was kicked out of her city, other women faced a much more degrading punishment. In medieval England, the shame of adultery was made public, and the punishment was both humiliating and lasting. Cucking stool. No one in Canterbury could have predicted what would happen to Maud in 1381. When her affair with a local priest came to light, the entire town buzzed with gossip and outrage. In the eyes of the people, there was no worse sin than betrayal, especially when it came to a woman. To make an example of Maud, the punishment was a public one. She was strapped into a cucking stool, a humiliating chair that left her exposed and vulnerable. Maud's punishment was as much about the public spectacle as it was about the actual dunking into the cold, filthy water. On the day of her punishment, Maud was paraded paraded through the streets, bound to the stool and thrust into the water. The crowd watched as she was dunked repeatedly into the filthy river, her screams echoing in the air. The cucking stool was meant to humiliate, and the more Maud struggled, the more the villagers laughed. It wasn't just the physical discomfort that left her broken. It was the degradation, the shame that would haunt her for the rest of her life. By the time she was pulled from the water, her reputation was destroyed, and the town had made its point. Infidelity would not be tolerated. Meanwhile, public humiliation wasn't just in England. In ancient Rome, women caught in adultery were forced to wear a sign of their shame for everyone to see. Public shaming. Fulvia was no stranger to the politics of power in ancient Rome, but in the 1st century BCE, her world came crashing down in a way she never expected. She had been caught in an affair with a prominent Roman official, something that was simply too much to ignore. In a society where women's loyalty to their husbands was sacred, there was no room for mercy. The punishment for her infidelity wasn't execution or exile. It was something far worse. She was dragged to the town square, where the entire community had gathered to witness her disgrace. For hours, she was paraded around, her face covered in shame and her hands bound, as the people of Rome hurled insults and spat at her. The elders read aloud the details of her crime, describing the affair in graphic terms for everyone to hear. Fulvia was forced to wear a stigma, a garment that marked her as an adulteress. Everywhere she went, the people of Rome saw her as nothing more than her betrayal. The whispers in the streets, the sideways glances. Fulvia couldn't just escape the shame, and neither could the city forget it. While Fulvia wore the mark of her shame, other women were branded with something even more lasting: tattoos that marked them for life. Tattooing. In ancient Greece, some women were left with a permanent reminder of their wrongdoings, literally etched into their skin. When a woman was caught committing adultery, the punishment was not just about physical pain, but also about leaving a mark that would never fade. Dionysia, a woman from Athens in the 3rd century BCE, learned this harsh reality when her affair with a local politician was exposed. Instead of being executed or imprisoned, Dionysia was brought before the city's magistrates. They decided that her crime would be memorialized on her body for the rest of her life. They branded her forehead with the letter A for adulteress. The ink wasn't just a symbol of her guilt, it was a mark she couldn't wash away. Every time she left her house, the people of Athens saw her for what she had done. It was a punishment designed to follow her forever, a scar that no amount of time could erase. But while the Greek method left a lasting mark, medieval Europe's solution was much less permanent, yet perhaps even more isolating. Imprisonment in monasteries. In medieval Europe, a woman's adultery was often seen as an insult to both God and society, and the consequences were severe. When Isabella, a famous noblewoman, was caught having an affair in 12th century England, her punishment wasn't the fiery end she had feared. Instead, she was sent to a life of quiet isolation in a monastery. The abbey wasn't a peaceful retreat, it was her prison. She was stripped of all her possessions, her fine clothes replaced with the simple habit of a novice. Once a noblewoman with a lavish life, Isabella now had nothing but stone walls and silence. There was no escaping the weight of her actions. For the rest of her days, Isabella was forced to live within the stone walls of the monastery, enduring the harsh discipline of the nuns and monks who ran the place. No contact with the outside world was allowed, and the once proud noblewoman was reduced to a silent figure, working the fields and performing menial tasks. This was Isabella's case in medieval Europe, but for some, isolation wasn't enough. In ancient Greece, the punishment for adultery could involve being forced to marry the very man a woman had cheated with. Forced to marry the lover. In ancient times, marriage and adultery were governed by strict rules, and a woman caught cheating often faced severe and highly public consequences. In ancient Athens, these consequences included public humiliation and harsh legal penalties, leaving no escape from the scandal. In the 4th century BCE, Callista's affair with a merchant became the talk of the town. Her husband, furious and determined to restore his honor, didn't settle for a quiet divorce or exile. Instead, he demanded that Callista marry her lover as punishment for her betrayal. The court, upholding the law of the land, agreed. The marriage wasn't about love, it was a public humiliation, a way to make sure everyone knew the price of dishonoring your spouse. Callista had no choice but to walk down the aisle, not to a man she loved, but to the man she had once betrayed. It wasn't just the end of her marriage, it was the end of her dignity. What happens when a marriage is broken, you may wonder? In ancient Rome, that was the next step, allowing the husband to end the marriage if his wife was unfaithful. Marriage annulment. In ancient Rome, marriage wasn't just a union of two people, it was a bond that upheld the very structure of society. So when a woman was caught cheating, it wasn't just her honor that was at stake, it was the family's reputation. In the 2nd century BCE, Cornelia, a noblewoman, was caught in an affair with a man who wasn't her husband. The scandal hit Rome like a thunderclap. In Roman society, marriage was more than a personal bond. It was a legal contract, one that secured family alliances and preserved status. When Cornelia's affair came to light, her husband, furious and humiliated, didn't take the usual route of divorce or punishment. Instead, he sought the ultimate penalty, annulment. He claimed she had dishonored their union, and he wanted her to face the repercussions. In the eyes of the law, their marriage was wiped away as if it had never happened. Cornelia lost everything, her place in society, her wealth, and her security. The annulment wasn't just a legal decision, it was the end of her marital life as she knew it. But the consequences of adultery didn't end with marriage annulment. In ancient Egypt, women found guilty of infidelity were often thrown out from society completely. Social ostracism. Merit had once enjoyed the luxuries of high society in ancient Egypt, but all of that came crashing down when her secret affair was discovered. In 1500 BCE, this noblewoman was caught with a servant, and it wasn't just her husband who was outraged. In Egypt, a scandal like this didn't stay private for long. Word spread like wildfire, and soon her name was being whispered in hushed tones across the kingdom. For Merit, there was no forgiveness. Her husband sought the most brutal form of punishment, social ostracism. Stripped of her status and cast out from her circle of influence, Merit was forced to live on the edges of society. The life she had known was over, and with it, the support and protection of her family. She walked alone, her reputation shattered, and the walls of her once glorious world now firmly shut against her. But what if a woman's punishment didn't just take away her social status? In ancient Persia, some women faced a much harsher reality: forced labor. Ancient Persia had a reputation for brutal punishment, and for Ardis, it was a harsh reality she never saw coming. In 500 BCE, Ardis was accused of infidelity, a crime that would cost her dearly. Unlike other cultures where death or exile were common, the Persian Empire chose to use a different kind of punishment: forced labor. Ardis was sent to work in the royal palace's kitchens, an unimaginable fall from prominence for someone of her former status. Once a respected woman in her community, she now scrubbed floors and cooked meals for the very people who had once served her. The work was tough, and the shame was unbearable. Day after day, she labored under harsh conditions, surrounded by others who had also lost their place in the society. With every task, the weight of her punishment seemed heavier, and the possibility of redemption slipped further away. Her days of dignity were gone, replaced by a life of servitude that reflected the depth of her shame. With no chance for redemption, Ardis lived the rest of her days as a mere servant, trapped by her past choices and the weight of her punishment. In contrast to forced labor, some cultures used humiliation as a way to cleanse the woman. In ancient India, women went through public shame rituals, showing the need for their purification. Humiliation rituals. In ancient India, a woman's affair was more than just a personal scandal. It could turn into a public spectacle meant to shame her into submission. In 300 BCE, Veda, a woman from Pataliputra, learned this the hard way. After being caught in an illicit relationship, she was subjected to a ritual designed to humiliate and cleanse her. The city square became the stage for her punishment. Veda was publicly paraded through the streets, her face twisted with shame as people threw insults, spat, and watched her every move. The ritual wasn't just about punishment, it was about sending a message. It was a society's way of purging itself of moral corruption by humiliating the wrongdoer until they were nothing more than a symbol of sin. For Veda, this was not only the end of her reputation, but the beginning of a life lived in shadows. However, humiliation rituals weren't the only way women suffered. In ancient Rome, a woman's mistakes could cost her even more: her reputation and her money through the loss of her dowry. Loss of dowry. In ancient Rome, a woman's dowry wasn't just a symbol of wealth. It was her security, her future, her very worth. But when Tullia, a noblewoman from Rome, was caught in an affair in the 1st century BCE, everything changed. Caught with a lover, her marriage crumbled, and so did her reputation. The punishment for her betrayal was swift and devastating. Her dowry was taken away by her husband, leaving her financially destitute. Without the dowry, Tullia lost her place in society, her status stripped away in a heartbeat. It wasn't just the loss of money, it was the loss of her security, her role, and her future. In Roman society, a woman's worth was tied to her marriage and dowry. With both taken from her, Tullia was left to face a future filled with shame and poverty, a fate worse than death for a Roman woman. But what happens when the church gets involved? In medieval Europe, women found guilty of adultery weren't just punished by their families or communities, they could also be kicked out of the church. Excommunication. In 12th century France, Beatrice, the wife of a powerful nobleman, found herself caught in an affair that would cost her everything. Her lover was a knight, a man who, at the time, was considered almost untouchable in the eyes of the church. But when Beatrice's sin came to light, it wasn't just her marriage that was at risk, it was her very soul. The church had the power to excommunicate her, and that's exactly what they did. Beatrice was summoned before the local bishop, who in front of an audience declared that her actions had not only betrayed her husband, but had also defiled the sanctity of marriage, an institution the church held sacred. The excommunication was swift, a public declaration of her separation from the divine community. No longer could she partake in communion, no longer could she be buried in hallowed ground. Her name, once respected in the noble circles, was now whispered in fear. She was cast out, not just from her husband's life, but from the grace of God. Her sin became a symbol of shame, and her life would forever be a cautionary tale of how far a woman could fall from grace in the eyes of both man and God. But exile wasn't always a peaceful escape. In some ancient Celtic cultures, banishment meant being sent into the wild to survive alone, with no help from others. Banishment to the wilderness. In the ancient Celtic world, punishment for a woman who broke the sacred rules of marriage was severe, far beyond what we can imagine today. In 300 BCE, Iseult, a young woman from a peaceful village, learned the harshness of those laws when her affair with a man from a rival tribe was uncovered. Her once secure and familiar life was turned upside down. The elders, in their harsh judgment, decreed that Iseult would be banished to the wilderness. Her village, the community she had known all her life, now cast her aside. They didn't just want to punish her, they wanted to erase her, making sure she could never return to her people. Iseult was left with only the forest for company. No more family gatherings, no more laughter with friends. The wilderness was now her home, but it was not a welcoming one. She was forced to survive alone, surrounded by harsh environments and the unpredictable dangers of the wild. With every day that passed, Iseult grew further from the life she once knew. There would be no redemption, no chance to rebuild what she had lost. As if banishment wasn't harsh enough, some women were punished in ways that affected not only them, but also their family's honor and reputation. Sacrifice of family honor. In ancient Rome, family honor was held above all else. For Lucia, a young woman from a respected patrician family, a brief affair would destroy all of it. It was 43 BCE when her scandalous relationship with a man from a rival family came to light, sending shockwaves through Roman society. The betrayal was not just personal, it was seen as an attack on the very honor of her family. The consequences were harsh and immediate. Lucia and her lover were both sentenced to death. The execution took place in the heart of Rome, in front of a crowd eager to witness the tragic end of the adulterous pair. But the punishment didn't end with their deaths. The entire family of Lucia was stripped of its status, no longer welcome among the elite of Rome. The Senate, furious at the scandal, decreed that they would be erased from the records of Roman nobility. The family's wealth, influence, and legacy were all lost. Her family's name was forever tarnished, and all they had worked for vanished in the wake of her actions. But while Lucia's family lost their place in society, others faced physical punishment, such as being whipped in the streets for everyone to see. Public whipping. In 39 CE, the streets of Rome were filled with people eager to witness the public punishment of Flavia, a Roman woman accused of adultery. The charge was clear. She had betrayed her husband, breaking the sacred vows that held Roman society together. For her, there would be no escape from the humiliation that awaited. Flavia had been caught in an affair with a man of lower status, and her punishment was meant to serve as a public example of what happened when women stepped out of line. In the crowded square, she was dragged before the crowd, her head bowed in shame, tied to a wooden post, her body exposed for all to see. Flavia stood silent, her guilt written all over her face. The executioner moved forward with a whip in his hand, and the crowd watched in silence as each strike landed, the sound of leather against flesh echoing in the air. With every lash, Flavia's body was marked, and her dignity stripped away. When the punishment ended, Flavia was left broken, her reputation destroyed for all to see. The streets of Rome that day would never forget the price she paid for her betrayal. But punishment didn't always stop with the woman. In ancient China, the consequences of adultery could affect even the children born from such affairs. Infanticide. In ancient China, adultery was not only a personal betrayal, but a violation of the family's honor. The punishment for a woman caught in infidelity was severe and often involved not just the guilty party, but also the innocent lives connected to her. In 612 BCE, Jia, a woman from a respected family, became a victim of this harsh system. After her affair was exposed, the consequences that followed were swift. Jia was forced to abandon her child, the product of her affair. Under the strict laws of the time, a child born of adultery was seen as an impure, unwanted being. The authorities ordered Zia to leave her baby in the wilderness, a fate that many children of adulterous unions met. Zia had no choice but to obey. With a broken heart, she placed her child in the cold, empty woods where survival was unlikely. But the punishment didn't stop there. Zia was shunned by her community, and her family's reputation was ruined. Her child was lost, and so was the life she had known, leaving her to live in the shadow of her crime. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, click on one of the boxes playing on your screen to watch more similar content.